Okay, so I am going to be discussing the evidence for why consuming a diet high in either animal foods or grains that is not offset by some type of base increases the risk for negative calcium balance, which has been shown in numerous human studies, increases bone resorption, aka bone breakdown in human studies, looking at bone resorption markers. There are numerous studies showing that then giving basically alkaline supplements, bicarbonate or citrate, improves bone health. There's even studies give out to 3 years showing increases in bone mass doing such. And that eating high amounts of animal protein increases the loss of sodium. That is basically to say that the increase in urinary sodium exceeds the sodium that is coming from the meat due to the acid load and the increase in basically kidney blood flow and GFR that occurs because of the acid load, and also the increase in propensity for uric acid stone formation. So I'm going to be covering a little bit about acid-base balance in the body, focusing on dietary acid loads, how we handle this, and then looking at the clinical studies showing the risks of not balancing high intake of animal foods or grains with fruits, vegetables that are low in oxalate, that's an important point, or alkaline supplements such as sodium or potassium, bicarbonate, or citrate. Okay, so what is acid in the body? Basically, we call this hydrogen ions, which actually exists in an aqueous solution as hydronium ions, H3O+. The base is bicarbonate, which can neutralize one hydrogen ion, and citrate is the other base, which can neutralize 3 hydrogen ions. So essentially what this schematic is showing, this is in the liver, this is what happens when we consume animal protein, which is 2 to 5 times higher in sulfur-containing amino acids compared to, basically beans and things like that. But in the liver, we oxidize sulfur-containing amino acids to a -2 sulfate, and we liberate 2 hydrogen ions, okay? Which again actually exists as 2 hydronium ions. But that's what we in the field call acid in the body. And fruits and vegetables, they bring basically things like citrate or malate, acetate, and other things as well that will get oxidized in the liver to form 3 bicarbonate. And that can neutralize 3 hydrogen ions. Okay, so that's the base. So this is sort of where acid is coming into the body by consuming either grains, which are higher in sulfur-containing amino acids, or animal foods, and this is offset by fruits and low oxalate vegetables. Because if you consume high oxalate fruits and vegetables, that prevents the breakdown of the potassium salts into the things like citrate that we need to form the bicarbonate, so those don't really count necessarily. So here's the same schematic of the sulfur-containing amino acids from grains and animal foods, basically liberating the 2 hydrogen ions and the negatively charged sulfate, and essentially when these get liberated, it will basically deplete bicarbonate here, as you can see, and you can't breathe out the negatively charged sulfate, so at first we'll use sodium to excrete it. We have to maintain electroneutrality, so when you're excreting a -2, 2 positively charged ions have to come with it. At first, that's sodium to give the kidneys time to increase the synthesis of ammonium, which will then combine with the -2 charge on the sulfate, the +2 here with the 2 ammonium, to excrete that acid out. Okay, so also to just give a better depiction of what happens here, the body will break down skeletal muscle to get at the glutamine to then release alpha-ketoglutarate to neutralize the endogenous acid load, and then also ammonium will be kicked out in the urine, basically to get rid of these 2 hydrogen ions. And this acidifies the urine. The 2NH4, though, is pulling that negatively charged sulfate that comes with the sulfur-containing amino acids. So there is a cost to eating a high amount of sulfur-containing amino acids, and that would be, acidifying the urine, having a lower urinary pH. I mean, I've done over a dozen tests after eating a high animal-based meal, and the urinary pH goes down anywhere from typically 6.5 down to a pH of 5, somewhere in that range. So the urine does become more acidic, and this is partially why. There's also what's called titratable acid that increases as well. But excreting, we say in the medical literature, we excrete the acid as ammonium. That's about 2/3 of the acid, the ammonium, and then the rest is titratable acid. So where does acid essentially, or where do these hydrogen ions basically come from? Two places, two amino acid types. So these are the sulfur-containing amino acids, methionine and cysteine, which is going to liberate those two hydrogen ions with a -2 sulfate. But then also cationic amino acids also, quote unquote, bring acid, liberate hydrogen ions. So lysine, arginine, and histidine, when you metabolize those, also liberate hydrogen ions as well, which again we said was the acid. The hydronium ion is what we consider the acid in the body. Now, glutamate and aspartate will actually subtract, quote unquote, acid from the body because it forms bicarbonate. So obviously we have a mixture of amino acids. These are just the amino acids that contribute to the acid-base balance. So these basically eliminate hydrogen, and these liberate hydrogen. There's obviously more amino acids than just 3, 4, 5, 7, right? But these are the only ones that contribute to acid-base balance in the body. Now, we can also produce organic acids. We call this lactic acid. Lactic acid does not exist in the body. This is how it actually exists. Two, lactate with a minus charge. Two hydrogen ions, as we said, exist as hydronium ions, bound to water as H3O+. But everybody knows the term lactic acid, but this is actually how it exists. We can produce keto acids, which exists as things like acetoacetate with the negative charge associated with the hydrogen ion, positive charge. And then we can create quote unquote uric acid, which actually again doesn't exist. It's the negatively charged urate and the two hydrogen ions, aka hydronium ions. Okay. So in a typical blend of proteins, what you have is you're going to get 120 millimoles of cationic amino acids, which we said contributes to the acid load. Then that will partially be offset by 96 millimoles from glutamate and aspartate, which will consume 96 millimoles of protons. But again, 120 minus 96, you're still in the positive. And then 30 millimoles of methionine plus cysteine will produce 60 millimoles of protons. So thus a typical blend of proteins will give a total acid load of 84 millimoles of hydrogen ions per day. So from an evolutionary perspective, why I believe we should be balancing animal foods with some type of base is because we would have always consumed bicarbonate. Bicarbonate exists in the blood at about 1,800 milligrams per liter. The interstitial fluid contains about the same amount as well. There's 3.5 liters of plasma in the human body and 10.5 liters of interstitial fluid. So that is over 25,000 milligrams of bicarbonate that we would have always had access to eating nose to tail. Bone also contains a tremendous amount of bicarbonate-forming substances as calcium carbonate. There's 1.8 million milligrams of those substances. And we would have consumed bone marrow and gnawed on bone. So this is a potential source as well. Natural mineral waters contain bicarbonate, anywhere typically between 200 and 1,800 milligrams of bicarbonate per liter. And of course, we would have gotten bicarbonate by consuming fruits and tubers, fruits when they were available, and tubers, they were hidden underground, but they were certainly available. In other words, modern day carnivores no longer really consume bicarbonate, which is an evolutionary mismatch. If you want to take this a step further, over the last 20 million years of evolution, 16 million years of that would have been on a high fruit diet, which would have been high bicarbonate producing, and only the last 2 to 4 million years would have been high animal food, but again, still with good bicarbonate consumption. In other words, 80 to 90% of the last 20 million years of evolution would have been a high bicarbonate forming diet. So where do we get basically some of the research? Where did this start to get interesting? actually the Lennon and Lehman group back in 1966. And really they started publishing actually in 1959 and onwards, started looking at basically diet and acid balance in the body. This was 16 metabolic balance studies in 14 healthy men in the clinical research center. And these individuals were basically in like a metabolic ward, so to speak. Type B diets that were given were providing more inorganic anions than inorganic cations through higher intakes of egg yolks. And I'm going to show you basically what the diets consisted of. So type A was a little bit more base producing, more juice, more coffee, which will give you more alkalinity than the type B diet. As you can see, are less juice, more egg yolks. The yolks actually are quite acidic. They bring a lot more hydrogen ions. Also, meat was very similar, but there was basically potatoes in the type A, and there was noodles and bread in the type B, which would be more acid producing. So what did these authors show? They actually showed that if the renal acid excretion is at least 39 milliequivalents per day, that there is actually acid retention in the body. You go into a positive acid balance. Now, a typical Western diet will produce a renal acid excretion anywhere between 50 and 100 milliequivalents per liter. So if you are excreting, and I'll show you kind of what this means when matched with urinary pH, anywhere from 39 milliequivalents per liter of acid or more per day, there's a chance that you are retaining acid in the body. And certainly when you hit 60 to 70 milliequivalents, then there is retention. And you can see more retention as you get closer to 100 milliequivalents of acid excreted per day. Here is urinary pH with net acid excretion. So essentially, if your urinary pH is 6.5 or lower, that is at the point where greater than half of the population will start having some retention of acid in the kidney. And certainly below 6 and at 5.9 here, which is a net acid excretion of 100, that's going to be worse. So here's basically a net acid excretion of 40 or higher. Over 50% of subjects are going to continually retain acid in the body. Again, the typical American diet is going to produce a renal net acid excretion somewhere between 50 and 100, and carnivores can certainly go up to 250 milliequivalents per day of acid. So definitely there is acid retention in most diets. And essentially what happens is once you reach a threshold of around 40 milliequivalents of acid per day being excreted out the kidneys, then for every 2.5 milliequivalents of acid above this threshold, about 1 milliequivalent is retained. Okay, so let's actually look at human studies giving higher protein intakes. So this was essentially like an Atkins diet. This was the low-carb, high-protein diet in 10 healthy subjects. They consumed their usual non-weight reducing diet at first, and then it was a carb-restricted diet for 2 weeks, and then another carb-restricted diet for 4 weeks. The urine pH went down from 6.09 to basically 5.5 in the induction and maintenance phases. Net acid excretion increased by 56 milliequivalents per day in the induction and 51 milliequivalents in the maintenance from a baseline of 61. So essentially you went from 61 to over 100 milliequivalents of acid per day from these diets. Urinary citrate significantly decreased. Urinary saturation of undissociated uric acid increased more than twofold on this high animal protein diet. Urinary calcium levels significantly increased from 160 milligrams per day to 258 milligrams per day. And this increase in urinary calcium was not compensated for by an increase in intestinal calcium absorption. Okay, so therefore, estimated calcium balance decreased by 130 milligrams per day and 90 milligrams per day in the maintenance and induction and maintenance phases, respectively. And then urinary markers of bone resorption tended to go up, like N-telepeptide, and markers of bone formation significantly decreased. Osteocalcin significantly decreased. So basically, this low-carb, high-protein animal protein diet for 6 weeks delivers a marked a marked acid load to the kidney, increases the risk for kidney stone formation, decreases calcium balance, and may increase the risk for bone loss due to a decrease in markers of bone formation and an increase in markers of bone resorption. Okay. So just to give you a quick glimpse of what the protein intake in the diet went from 90 to 164 and 170. Here was the calcium intakes, good calcium intakes in this study as well, which, I mean, most carnivores are not going to be getting this type of calcium unless they're consuming pretty large amounts of dairy. But even in this study, you can see here, I just covered those harms. Urinary pH went from slightly over 6 to about 5.5. Urinary ammonium increased. Net acid excretion, we had said, went from about 60 to, they added about 52 milliequivalents. So about 115 milliequivalents of net acid excretion per day. And here, urinary citrate did significantly go down on the high animal protein diet. There was no increase in relative saturation ratio for calcium oxalate. However, there was a significant increase in undissociated uric acid, which would increase the risk for uric acid kidney stones. Here was the increase in urinary calcium, which was significant, and there was not a significant increase in fractional intestinal calcium absorption. Numerically there was, but certainly not enough to offset the significantly higher levels of calcium excretion out the urine. This is just some other markers of, we covered how the urinary pH went down. Sodium loss actually did slightly increase, but it was not significant. Uric acid did significantly increase. We said citrate went down, and net acid excretion went up. Okay, and then endogenous creatinine clearance does go up with higher protein diets. It causes hyperfiltration, which causes sodium loss, and I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so although the bone resorption markers were not significantly increased, they did trend upwards. Serum osteocalcin calcium levels declined significantly. Results of this study support previous in vitro experiments showing chronic metabolic acidosis enhances bone resorption and diminishes bone formation. So this is another study, effect of protein level intake on urinary and fecal calcium and calcium retention of young adult males. So these are in healthy people, again, increasing the protein intake in these 18 to 20-year-old males from about 50 grams to about 140. Highly significantly increased urinary calcium from 175 to 338 milligrams. That is a big increase, essentially a twofold increase in calcium excretion. The apparent absorption was higher, but by only 69 milligrams. And the mean daily calcium balance went from 10, so positive, to a negative calcium balance on the low and high protein intakes, respectively. This is just kind of showing you the nitrogen intakes and urinary calciums from the low and the high protein intakes. Basically showing you about 120 here, going to about 300 for the urinary calcium, and the fecal calcium's not changing that much from low protein to high protein. Okay, this was another study on the calcium balance and acid-base status of women as affected by increasing protein intake and then by sodium bicarbonate ingestion. So 6 women ranging in the age of 38 to 62 participated in this 40-day metabolic study. The diet contained 44 grams of protein during the first 16 days and then 102 grams during the remaining 24 days. The increase in protein intake significantly increased urinary calcium and renal net acid excretion, and the mean net calcium balance became negative. Another study showing that your calcium balance can become negative when you eat a higher protein diet. However, the ingestion of sodium bicarbonate, which is base, alkalinized the urine and reversed the increase in urinary calcium associated with the higher protein intake. The mean net calcium became positive. Okay, and this is just kind of showing you that these individuals, 4 of them were about 60 years old, and then 2 of them were about 40 years old. Okay. And this shows the effect of dietary treatment on urinary and fecal calcium and net calcium balance, just showing you that basically on the lower protein intake, calcium balance was positive. When they increased protein intake, it became negative. Here also is just showing kind of the difference in ages on these markers here. So basically in the group that was 40 years old, in the 44 low protein, calcium was 110, which increased to 171 milligrams of calcium in the urine, so that's a big jump. But the jump's even bigger in those who are 60 and over, going from 83 milligrams of calcium per 24 hours to more than doubling to 188. So it's showing that even the harms are even more profound as you get older. This is showing that even though all these harmful effects occurred, blood pH would, if you looked at your blood pH, it would be normal, right? It's in the normal range. Normal range is 7.35 to 7.43, you know, and bicarbonate did drop by about 1.32 milliequivalents per liter, but this would not show up as a low bicarbonate level on a test, which would have to be less than 22. But you are seeing, though, that the blood is becoming slightly more acidic, going down from a pH of 7.42 to 7.41, and the bicarbonate is becoming depleted, going from 25 milliequivalents to 23.66. Okay, and that is enough to produce negative calcium balance. This is another study in 6 healthy males consuming diets. Now, what they wanted to do is they said, okay, urinary calcium is definitely significantly increasing, but what if we're missing the absorption somehow? So what they decided to do was actually basically give an extremely small amount of calcium, only 100 milligrams per day, to not really miss any increases in absorption. And what they found is that basically on the very low protein intake, 51 milligrams of urinary calcium was excreted. On the medium protein intake of 76.8 grams, almost 100 milligrams was excreted. So basically almost the entire amount that was being ingested was excreted. And then on the high protein intake of 153.6 grams, 161 milligrams of calcium came out in the urine, which is significantly more than what they were eating. In other words, there's definitely an enhanced loss that cannot be compensated for by an increase in absorption because you have more loss than you're even ingesting in this study. So they say our data suggests that increased GFR with possible inhibition of renal tubular resorption of calcium may be an additional mechanism responsible for the calciuretic effect. So we have increases in bone resorption from some other studies I just covered before, but I'm going to show you more after this one, showing an increase in bone breakdown, but also because of the basically acid load in the kidneys, there could be a reduction too in the resorption of calcium, reabsorption of calcium at the kidney level. This was just the age of the participants, so they were young and healthy. This is just showing you basically calcium intake, excretion, and balances. So as you can see here, basically these are the nitrogen intakes. So this is the high protein here, and it's showing you basically negative calcium balances throughout. Okay, this is another study from Ruth Walker, calcium retention in the adult human male as affected by protein intake. This is in 9 young men given 800 milligrams of calcium daily. They were fed 47, 95, or 142 grams of protein each day for 15 days. Subjects retained an average of 12 and 1 milligram calcium respectively when fed the lower protein, but lost 85 milligrams of calcium when they were fed 142. So another study showing negative calcium balance on a high protein diet. There was a highly significant difference in the urinary calcium, the respective values being 217, 303, and 426 milligrams of calcium when the subjects were fed low, medium, and high protein. Fecal calcium was significantly decreased as the protein intake was increased from 47 to either 95 or 142, but not when it was increased from 95 to 142 grams. So this is just showing you essentially here mean daily urinary and fecal calcium and calcium balances at all 3 levels of protein intake. And you can see here low and medium, you still have a positive calcium balance, but at the high protein intake, both in the stabilization phase, which is after these 3, and during this first phase of high protein, it is a negative calcium balance eating a high protein diet. Another study showing this. Okay, so this is just showing that basically, as protein intake goes down, urinary calcium excretion goes down. And then this is the stabilization period. As protein intake goes up, calcium excretion goes up. Now, we've looked at all of these studies looking at healthy people. What about osteoporosis? This was in 5 untreated osteoporotic patients. They were in this metabolic unit for 30 days while receiving a control, 0.8 grams per kilogram protein and high protein diet, 2 grams per kilogram. The high protein diet increased urinary calcium and produced a negative calcium balance, no shocker there, without causing a significant change in calcium absorption. Hence, increased dietary protein acutely causes a negative calcium balance in osteoporotic patients and may contribute to bone loss in this disease. Here's just showing basically the urinary calcium from the control diet, which was 90, and then that basically doubled on the high protein diet. And you can see the urinary pH is decreasing too on the higher diet. Potassium also dropped too. Okay, and this is just showing calcium balance again, high protein. You can see here the balance was minus 64 milligrams per day. Okay, how do we know though that besides those some previous studies that showed bone resorption, how do we know some of this is coming from the bone? This was a nice study, changes in bone turnover in young women consuming different levels of dietary protein intake. So they evaluated the effect of dietary protein on markers of bone turnover in 16 healthy young women. The experiment consisted of 2 weeks of a well-balanced diet containing moderate amounts of calcium, sodium, and protein, followed by 4 days on an experimental diet containing one of 3 levels of protein, low, medium, high. Urinary calcium excretion was significantly higher on the high versus low protein diet. Urinary N-telepeptide, which is a marker of bone resorption, excretion was significantly greater during the high protein than the low protein. So again, markers of bone resorption significantly increase when you consume a high protein diet and significantly increase calcium loss in the urine that is not offset by calcium absorption, leading to significant a negative calcium balance. There was no increase also in bone formation markers such as osteocalcin, bone-specific alkaline phosphatase when comparing the low to high, suggesting that bone resorption was increased without a compensatory increase in bone formation. Our data suggests that a high level of dietary protein, at least a portion of the increase in urinary calcium reflects increased bone resorption, aka breakdown, aka dissolution, however you want to talk about it, but this is suggesting that, yes, eating high amounts of animal protein that's not balanced with base will break down your bone. That's what these studies are suggesting, and there's numerous ones that suggest that. This is the marker of bone resorption and telepeptide, basically higher levels being more in the higher protein intake. Here's another study. This is 2 51-day human studies looking at different levels of dietary protein intake. Dietary treatments included 50-gram protein diet, 150-gram protein diet. The low protein diet then supplemented with sulfur amino acids that would equal that of what would be basically ingested from the 150-gram protein diet. And they looked at different levels of phosphorus and calcium intake in these 16 young adult males. What they found in this study again was that the high protein and the sulfur amino acids caused increases in hydroxyproline. Hydroxyproline is released when type 1 collagen is degraded, and hence it's a marker of bone resorption. So this again shows that higher protein intakes increases markers of bone resorption. They stated that the protein or the sulfur amino acid induced increases in urinary calcium result in increased bone resorption, aka breakdown. This is just the urinary hydroxyproline levels in the low protein medium phosphate versus the high protein medium phosphate, showing significant increases here, and in study 2 as well. Relationship of animal protein-rich diet to kidney stone formation and calcium metabolism. This was 15 young normal subjects studied during 3 12-day dietary periods during which their diet contained vegetable protein, and egg protein, or animal protein. As the fixed acid content of the diets increased, urinary calcium excretion increased from 103 milligrams in the vegetarian diet to 150 milligrams on the animal protein diet, which was a significant increase. There was a modest reduction in urinary cyclic AMP excretion and serum parathyroid hormone and 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D levels, consistent with acid-induced bone dissolution. There was no change in fractional intestinal calcium absorption. The inability to compensate for the animal protein-induced calciuretic response may be a risk factor for the development of osteoporosis. The animal protein diet, when its electrolyte composition and quantity of protein were kept the same as the vegetarian, conferred an increased risk for uric acid stones as well. So this wasn't even that really high of an acid load animal protein diet. The net acid excretion only went from about 12 to 39 milliequivalents per liter or per day. and the pH didn't drop too bad from 6.5 to 6.17. So this wasn't even really that high of an acid load diet. Ammonium did increase. Here's the calcium levels significantly increasing in the urine from 103 to 150, and uric acid significantly increasing here as well from 479 milligrams per day to 564 milligrams per day in the animal protein diet. Parathyroid hormone went down. 24-hour urinary cyclic AMP went down, and the 125 dihydroxyvitamin D also went down on the animal protein. Undissociated uric acid did significantly increase. It more than doubled here on the animal protein diet. So that is increasing the propensity for uric acid kidney stones to form. Here's some notable quotes from the study. Our results suggest that the major calciuretic factor during animal protein ingestion is bone resorption in response to the acid load. Since there is no compensation for the bone resorptive urinary calcium losses that occur during high animal protein intake, a negative calcium balance ensues. This contrasts with the ability of young individuals to adapt to a salt-induced urinary calcium loss by raising serum parathyroid and 125 dihydroxy levels, thereby permitting a compensatory rise in intestinal calcium loss. In other words, they're saying the increase in calcium loss with high salt diets, there's a compensatory rise in calcium absorption that offsets it, and they go on to say that a chronic acid load, aka from protein, may result in bone loss. They also say in addition to hypercalciuria, the animal protein diet was associated with the greatest urinary excretion of uric acid. This is not surprising since animal flesh is high in high purine contents. In addition, the high acid ash content of the meat diet caused acidification of the urine, raising undissociated uric acid concentration. This urinary environment would favor precipitation of uric acid crystals and would represent a particular risk for patients with gouty, basically kidney stones or uric acid stones. And then they also went on to state a reduction in urinary citrate would be expected to enhance the crystallization of calcium oxalate and calcium phosphate, since citrate is an inhibitor of the crystallization of these salts. Probably not oxalate though as well, because you're getting rid of a lot of the oxalate when you eliminate vegetables. So maybe more calcium phosphate kidney stones. Okay, now what happens when you eat a large meat meal? Well, I'm going to show you. Basically, renal blood flow and GFR significantly increase because of the acid load, which then causes significant sodium loss. And I'll show you that here. So here's another, basically this is showing that hyperfiltration occurs for at least 3 hours after you eat a large meat meal. It's only quote unquote significantly increased though out to about, somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes here, going from 90 to 110. And you can see here urinary sodium is significantly increased out to 3 hours. I don't know exactly how long this would continue. They didn't measure it past that. That wouldn't matter. Here's another showing fractional excretion of sodium. That wouldn't necessarily matter if balance of sodium didn't significantly go down. So what the study found is that the increase in urinary loss of sodium was significantly more than the amount of sodium that was brought by the meat. So when you are constantly excreting large amounts of acid, that is leading to constant hyperfiltration at the kidney level and significant increases in losses of sodium out the urine. Now, the body is good at maintaining a tight pH and a tight bicarbonate in the blood. It is not nearly as good at doing this in the interstitial fluid because it does not have the same proteins that can neutralize, that can buffer, and bind to the hydrogens like albumin and hemoglobin that are in blood. So interstitial fluid becomes acidic much more early on than blood and base in the blood. Bicarbonate and pH in the blood won't really change for a long time, but interstitial fluid will. And that is where even minor changes in interstitial fluid acidity will stimulate the osteoclast to break down bone, which is probably why when we look at all those studies, all the bone resorption markers are, going up and suggesting bone breakdown, even though the pH and the bicarbonate is normal. Well, because it's probably not normal in the interstitial fluid, because small changes in interstitial fluid pH will activate osteoclasts to break down bone. Okay, so it's really hidden acidosis in the interstitial fluid. We can't see it. That's where the music is singing. We can't hear it, but it's the interstitial fluid. Now, even in the blood, however, the body is not perfect at maintaining acid-base balance. Not perfect. This was looking at published data of healthy individuals. And as we age, blood hydrogen ions go up. And I'm going to show you what that means in a clinically significant measurement. And plasma bicarbonate goes down. So by the time you're 70, this is in a normal healthy individual, plasma bicarb is below normal, okay? So in these healthy individuals, once we reach 70, we're seeing bicarbonate levels, though, that are below normal. So it might take to about 70 to actually go below normal. And in carnivores who have sent me their bicarbonate levels, ranging from 35 to 45 years old, are typically somewhere between 23 and 24. So they're somewhere around 60-year-old levels of bicarbonate, even though they're 35 to 45. And this was redrawn by Vorman, looking at the age in healthy people. And you start off at really 7.43. But as you age, your blood literally does become more acidic. More protons do accumulate in the blood, even though the interstitial fluid is by far highly acidic. Down all the way to about 7.36. You're still considered normal, even at 7.35, even though there's literally more acid in the blood. And as we said here, bicarbonate does go significantly low by the time you're 70. So I hope this sort of helped explain why I believe we should be balancing high animal protein or grain intake, which I don't think we really should be consuming grains. So I'll just say why I balance my high animal protein intake with base is to offset these harms.